Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all to the online course on East Caucasian languages organized by the Linguistic Convergence Laboratory of the HSE University, Moscow, Russia. My name is Chiara Naccarato. I'm a research fellow in the lab and the moderator of today's session. Today is the first lecture in the series of 9, entitled Linguistic Geography of East Caucasian Languages. The author of this lecture are our colleagues Yuri Koryakov and Samira Verhees. Samira will be the speaker today, but you can ask questions to both of them. Before introducing my colleagues, I would like to clarify some organizational issues. Each lecture will be recorded, live streamed on YouTube, and stored there afterwards. The lectures will go uninterrupted, followed by a question period. Those of you who are joining the lecture via Zoom will be muted throughout the session in the interest of the lecturer and sound quality. You may send your questions via the Zoom chat or YouTube live chat. At the end of the talk, I will read selected questions out loud for the speaker to answer them. We apologize in advance that there might not be enough time to address all the questions, but Yuri and Samira will be able to read them after the talk and hopefully find a way to answer you. So it is my pleasure to introduce Yuri Koryakov and Samira Verhees. Yuri is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Linguistics of the Russian Academy of Science. His main research interests include linguistic maps, area linguistics and linguistic typology, language classification and transcription. Among his latest projects are the Atlas of the Languages of Russia, the creation of practical transcriptions for minority languages, and the demographic database of Dagestanian villages. Yuri has co-edited several volumes of the encyclopedic collection Languages of the World, which is a project of the Russian Academy of Science, and he is co-editor of the volume The Caucasian Languages and International Handbook, which is going to appear for the Greuter Mouton. Yuri's latest publications include papers on multilingualism and the sociolinguistic situation in the Caucasus for the journal Languages of the Caucasus and the Oxford Handbook of Languages of the Caucasus. Samira is a research fellow at the Linguistic Convergence Laboratory. Her main research interests include the languages of the Caucasus, in particular of the East Caucasian family, area linguistics and linguistic typology, language documentation, in particular of the Andic languages Botlik and Andi, language variation and change. Among the topics of her recent research are evidentiality and lexical borrowing. Samira is currently part of the team that is developing the typological atlas of the languages of Dagestan. Apart from coordinating the project and being the author of several chapters, Samira is curating and expanding the dataset of East Caucasian villages, which is at the base of the visualizations in the atlas. Samira's latest publications include papers on multilingualism and lexical borrowing for the prestigious journals Language and International Journal of Bilingualism. Today's lecture will be on the linguistic geography of East Caucasian languages. Samira, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Chiara. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. Yes, so let's start with a basic question. What actually is linguistic geography? Linguistic geography studies the geographical distribution of languages and their varieties on one hand, and linguistic features and their variants on the other hand. In this lecture, we will focus on the distribution of languages and dialects in particular. If you're interested in the distribution of some linguistic features among the East Caucasian languages and their neighbors, then you can check out our typological atlas of the languages of Dagestan. But today we will only be talking about distribution of languages and dialects. So some of the main questions are: which languages are spoken where, and did their territory undergo any major changes? This kind of implies that we already know which East Caucasian languages there are, and how we can locate their speech communities, which sound like fairly obvious things, but they're not always so straightforward in this area. So here's the outline of this lecture. We'll start with a brief introduction of the languages in the area, followed by a brief history of how different languages and different language families settled here initially, followed by classification, so some historical approaches to classifying this language family, followed by branching, so the classification into languages as opposed to dialects. Then we will discuss language and ethnic identity, which are often sort of interrelated in a complex way in this area. Then we will show how these things sort of show up in the census data, so how you can see different approaches to ethnic identity and different approach to classification back in the way people are represented in the census. Then we will discuss the differences between the highlands and the lowlands as distinct areas of language use, followed by a discussion of some changes in the language territory in the 19th and 20th century. Because in the last 200 years, a lot of changes have taken place, and they're still going on, and they have some serious consequences for this linguistic area. And then the last thing we will discuss is the vitality of the East Caucasian languages. So let's start with a brief introduction of some basic facts. The East Caucasian languages are spoken mainly in the three North Caucasian republics of Ingushetia, Chechnya, and Dagestan, which you can see. It's a little small, but I think you can more or less see the borders here. So they're located sort of continuously next to each other. This is a relatively small territory, so the three republics taken together are about 70,000 square kilometers, and it's largely covered in mountainous terrain, with a total population of over 4.5 million. So the percentage of mountainous terrain is currently roughly 48% for Dagestan, 44% for Ingushetia, and 35% for Chechnya. But this is the modern territory, which includes a lot of flat land that was sort of added to the territory later. So if we look at older administrative divisions, which had a smaller territory and which were closer to the traditional area of dispersion of these languages, then we get very different figures. So in that case, Dagestan would consist of about 82% of mountainous terrain, and Chechnya would be about 50% mountainous terrain. So basically, the vast majority of East Caucasians have inhabited mountainous areas for centuries, and only more recently they started migrating to the lowlands. So in addition to these three republics, there are also several East Caucasian communities which reside in adjacent areas of Georgia and Azerbaijan. You can see them on this map very well over here, northern Azerbaijan, and over here in Georgia. And there are also some more recent diasporas in Turkey and Jordan, which mostly date back only to the 19th century. Their neighboring languages include Kumyk, Azeri, and Nagay, which are Turkic languages. There are also Tat, Ascetic, and Armenian, which are Indo-European. Georgian, Kartvelian language, and Kabardian, which is a West Caucasian language. On this map, you can see the East Caucasian languages divided by their respective branches. And you can see the neighboring languages as well. So you can see the Turkic languages along the coastline, Russian over here in the north, and Georgian and Azerbaijan. Now, we took this map from 1926 because the distribution of the languages in 1926 is more or less similar to the traditional distribution of the languages. So as probably everybody knows, the language of administration is Russian, and it has some local presence in urban areas and historically at the northern periphery. Arabic is the language of liturgy, since people in the area are predominantly Sunni Muslim, but there are no local Arabic-speaking communities currently. So let's move on to a brief history of how they all got there in the first place. First of all, the East Caucasian languages. East Caucasian languages are considered both indigenous and endemic to the area where they are spoken. So this means that they're not only native to this area, but also that they have probably always been more or less in that same area. Whereas for some of the neighboring languages, which we also consider indigenous, because they have no significant speech communities outside the area, we do not consider them endemic because there is historical evidence for them appearing in this area at some point, so migrating from a different area. There's evidence for some cultural continuity with early Neolithic archaeological sites in Dagestan, which would further confirm that they're endemic to the region. East Caucasian is considered an ancient deep-level family, which is comparable to Indo-European in terms of its internal divergence. And it has an estimated age of about 6,000 to 8,000 years, based on both lexical statistics and based on the type of shared lexicon between the proto-languages. The historical homeland of the languages is situated a little bit more to the south and not in the mountains, in south-central Transcaucasia. There's in Joanna Nichols's lecture from last year, there are more details on this particular topic. So the oldest attested East Caucasian language is Caucasian Albanian, sometimes also called Agvan. It was recorded on palimpsests that were found on Mount Sinai and which date back to the 5th and 6th centuries. Caucasian Albanian is an ancestor of Udi, or its sister language, and it was also the language of Caucasian Albania, which is a state that existed more or less from the 2nd century before Common Era to the 8th century, the 8th century Common Era, sorry. So here you can see more or less the distribution of Caucasian Albanian, which is essentially the contours of the former independent state of Caucasian Albania. Later, it sort of branched out into this area as well. At some points in history, it was part of the Persian Empire, but this is basically its core area of dispersion. And this is actually quite close geographically to the historical homeland of the East Caucasian family. So here you can see two maps. One that shows the traditional area roughly by the 1800s, And on the right, again, the map which I already showed, which shows the distribution from 1926. As you can see, the distribution of the East Caucasian languages here is quite similar. So in this span of over 100 years, there were not a lot of big changes in terms of the dispersion of these languages. We don't really know very well what happened before 1800. We can sort of localize specific kingdoms or maybe specific languages, but there's not really enough information to really draw a complete informed map of who lives where for this period. But we suspect that the traditional dispersion for 1800 is probably representative of a longer historical period before that. Then the appearance of Iranian people in the area, which happened also very early, but they're not quite as old as the East Caucasians, at least in this region. So the tribes like the Scythians, the Alans, which are the ancestors of the contemporary Ossetians, and the Sarmatians appeared in the general area in the first millennium before Common Era. And only the Ossetians are still really present in the Eastern Caucasus area, sharing a border with Ingushetia. Tats appeared as part of the Sasanian expansion into the Caucasus in the 3rd and 7th centuries. And they live in a number of settlements in northern Azerbaijan and in a few places in southern Dagestan as well. Actually, in Dagestan currently, most of them live in the city of Derbent. Also, Persian functioned as an important regional language due to its role in the successive empires in the region, to which the Eastern Caucasus and the East Caucasian languages also belonged. Then the Turkic tribes arrived a little bit later still. So the contemporary Turkic nations that we find in the Caucasus now emerged from confederations of nomadic tribes who arrived in waves during the early to late Middle Ages. From the 7th to 9th centuries, there was also the Khazar Khaganate, which we know was a Turkic state. But it was a Turkic state, but it was polyethnic. And they didn't really leave any traces of their language behind. So there are some hypotheses that they were probably Oghuric speaking, so a language that would be related to contemporary Chuvash. But they never really left behind a lot of decipherable writing. So we can't really be sure. And moreover, despite the fact that the Khazar Khaganate was quite an important political entity, it sort of disappeared afterwards. So there are some hypotheses that they kind of assimilated with other Turkic peoples, but there are currently no traces in the area of any type of Khazar language or Khazar people as a distinct entity. The Kipchaks appeared in the 11th century in the northern steppes, from where they spread to Nakh and Dagestanian territories. So these are the ancestors of the contemporary Kumyk and Nagai people in the area. The Oghuz Turks appeared in about the same period in the area of present-day Azerbaijan around the 10th century. So these Turkic speakers inhabited the lowlands, whereas the East Caucasians who were already there mostly lived in the mountains. The Kumyks and Azeris specifically settled in the area along the Caspian coast. Azeris mostly in the south until Derbent, and then Kumyks further up north as well as in Chechnya. So historically they came from different directions more or less, and you can still more or less see that in how they are distributed. The Nagais continued a nomadic lifestyle in the lowlands to the north of Dagestan and Chechnya, and only stopped doing this relatively recently. Then Arabic, there were some Arabs present in the area at some point because Arabs captured Derbent in the late 7th century and established a caliphate. But this caliphate didn't last very long, and they did not establish a lasting local community as far as we know. At least currently there are no more Arabs in the area that have been there for a long time. Though there is some evidence of historical Arab communities that sort of stayed behind after the fall of the caliphate or after some kind of missionary work, and who were subsequently Turkified and sort of assimilated with mostly the Azerbaijani in the area. The process of Islamization nonetheless continued in the absence of the Arabs, and but it took a very long time. So it started essentially in the around the 7th century, and it was completed only by the 18th century for the Chechen and Ingush, and the 15th century for Dagestan. So this is a process that took many hundreds of years. To this day, some knowledge of Arabic, of course, is widespread in the area, and there are a lot of Arabic loanwords in the languages. But typically, the knowledge of Arabic is limited to reading prayers. Then the Russians, who arrived more or less as the last, when they started their southward expansion of the Russian Empire in the 18th century. And subsequently, they colonized the Caucasus, of course, in the 19th century. During the Soviet period, there was a large influx of Russians, especially in the cities of these republics. And due to the introduction of the compulsory Soviet school system, Russian has since then expanded as a lingua franca in the area. Currently, the Russians live mostly in cities. Many of them left after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Though in Dagestan, the population still shows some sort of steady growth, at least numerically. So the numbers are going slightly up, but we don't know if there's a trade-off between people leaving and more new people coming into the area. A local variety of Russian emerged as the language of multi-ethnic urban areas in Dagestan. So basically, prior to Russian, there was no single lingua franca for the entire area. The area was sort of cut up between regional lingua francas. But in the course of the processes some of the processes that we will be talking about today, people moved out of their traditional area into areas where different lingua francas were spoken. And as all this mixing was occurring, Russian was used more frequently for interethnic communication, because this is the only language that everybody in the area, currently at least, speaks in addition to their native language. Then Armenians and Georgians, they basically, well, they were always there because, of course, they're historically important neighboring states for the North Caucasus. But they appeared in the direct vicinity or within the Eastern Caucasus area specifically only in the 18th century, because at the time the Russian Empire sort of encouraged Christians from the Caucasus to move to its southern frontier. And in that period, quite a large number of Armenians came to the area, some Georgians as well, but they were significantly less numerous. And to this day, there are still small communities of Armenians which remain in Dagestanian cities, although their number is going down. There's also one village which is supposedly, or which is Armenian speaking essentially, But that is kind of a special case because it was originally a Tat-speaking village that shifted to Armenian at some point. All right, so classification of the languages of the family. Classifications of this language family are fairly young because for a long time there wasn't even a sort of list of the languages that belong to this family. So you can find a mention of a large number of different tribes that would inhabit the Eastern Caucasus area in ancient sources, so among ancient Greek geographers. But the correspondence of these tribal names to contemporary languages or ethnic groups is often not really straightforward. Many of the names listed don't really have a clear contemporary correspondent, and then some which kind of look the same could mean different things. For example, in these sources you find a name like Leg, which could either correspond to Lesgian tribes in general. It could be, it could have to do with contemporary Lesgians. It could refer to the Alak, which are a separate branch of the family. And it could be used as a sort of catch-all term to refer to the inhabitants of Dagestan, or like the Northeast Caucasus. So there are all kinds of hypotheses about what these names correspond to, but there are very few cases where it can actually be shown convincingly that this refers to a specific language or even a specific ethnic group. So medieval Arabic geographers were also interested in the area, and they mentioned the linguistic diversity, with estimates ranging from 70 to 306 languages. But they do not identify specific East Caucasian languages besides Caucasian Albanian. So these estimates about the number of languages usually have to do with tribes and the idea that each of these tribes have their own unique language. So for example, we find this quote, "This mountain range is huge," talking about the Caucasus in general. It is said that 360 languages are spoken there. I rejected this before until I saw many cities myself, and each city has its own language in addition to Azerbaijani and Persian. So this is a quote from a geographer of the 10th century. I should probably admit here that I don't read Arabic, so I got this quote from a Russian source who collected all these different descriptions of the area from Arabic sources. Actually, the term mountain of tongues, which is used to refer to the Caucasus as a whole, as a sort of super linguistically diverse area, is also due to an Arabic geographer. European sources from the 13th and 18th century, from this general period, are not very informative. They generally consider the Eastern Caucasus to be a Tatar territory, which refer to and they refer to the people there as Dagestanian Tatars, where Tatar is just a sort of general cover term for any kind of Turkic people. The term Lesgian also sometimes appears, Lesgian or specifically Lesgi, as a synonym for Dagestanian Tatars. So for example, Adam Oliarius, a German explorer who visited the area in the 17th century, writes, "Now let us turn to the current inhabitants of this region. They are Tatars, the Persians call them Lesgians, but they call themselves Dagestanian Tatars," which means so much as mountain Tatars. And until the 19th century, the Eastern Caucasus was kind of not very well known generally. So if you look at this map, you can see that there's not a lot going on between Georgia and the Caspian coast, besides a lot of mountains, not a lot of toponyms, just a few important cities, like for example, here in the north you have Terki, which is the former southern frontier of the Russian Empire. And you have, of course, Derbent here. Derbent is also the place where most of these early explorers were sort of staying. So a lot of them mostly describe Derbent, and then they have some additional information, and that's about it. Also here you can see Buynaksk, and you can see Tarku, which is the former capital of the Khazar Khaganate. So only some key places, and this area between Tiflis and Tarku, there's basically nothing. So more detailed information appears only in the 19th century, when the area becomes part of the Russian Empire. A lot of linguistic and other fieldwork is undertaken in this period, and the first grammatical descriptions of East Caucasian languages appear in this period. So for example, in the late 18th century, a little bit earlier than the rest, the German scientist Johann Anton Rudinstedt came to the area, and he published a book with a description of southern Russia and the Caucasus, which consists of a lot of different things: ethnography, biology, like descriptions of local plants and animals, and also word lists in several languages. So he actually wrote down some language material, some comparative word lists in a number of East Caucasian languages. Then in the 19th century, of course, we had Piotr Karlovich Uslar, who wrote grammar descriptions, very detailed ones about Chechen, Avar, Lak, a variety of Dargwa, Lesgian, which at the time was conventionally referred to as Kurin, Tabasaran, and he also wrote some general works on Caucasian linguistics. There is also this journal called the, I'm not sure how to translate it actually, but it's basically a journal that contains all sorts of data about the region, mostly about the people. So it has grammar sketches, ethnographic data, a lot of recorded folklore material, and it appeared once or twice a year in the period from 1881 to 1915, and then later also in 1926 and 1929. So from this area, we have quite a lot of rich material about these languages that were before that more or less unknown. So initially, when the first linguistic work on these languages began, the Nakh and Dagestanian languages were considered to constitute separate families. So the current Nakh branch on one hand, which includes Chechen, Ingush, and Sovotush, and the Dagestanian branch on the other hand, which consists of basically all of the other languages of the family, they were considered separate. But then Julius Klaproth in 1831 recategorized them as two branches of one family, which is where the alternative family name of Nakh Dagestanian comes from. Now, in spite of this traditional division into two major branches, there are almost no shared innovations common to all Dagestanian languages as opposed to the Nakh languages. So this division into these two main branches is kind of a relic of how these languages were viewed before. And for this reason, the Nakh branch is now more commonly considered to be a sister language, a sister branch to other branches of East Caucasian. So back to the 19th century, an almost complete list of languages and a fairly close to modern grouping is found in von Erkert's 1895 collection of short comparative grammar sketches based on linguistic surveys in a large number of idioms. So this book basically contains a large number of translated sentences in a really large number of languages and dialects. And based on this material, Erkert reached some conclusions about which ones are more similar to each other and which ones are more divergent. And in his account, the East Caucasian languages form the eastern group of the North Caucasian languages, which were divided into two main branches. First of all, the northwestern branch, which included Chechen, the Aro-Ando-Tsesek languages, and the Dargwic and Lak groups. And then there was southeastern, which included the Lesgic group and Chinaluk as a separate branch. Many idioms in this work were considered dialects rather than languages, but the list of specific idioms that are distinguished is very similar to the traditional classification that is still in use today. So here is an overview of his classification. First of all, there's the Kurin group, which contains Kurin proper or Lesgian, and all the other Lesbic languages such as Rutu, Tsahur, Agu, Tabasran, Archi, Udi, Jek, so currently referred to as Kris, at the time Jek, Budukh, and Chinaluk. So Chinaluk here is a part of the Lesgic branch. Then for Dargwa, he recorded sort of Vurkun proper material from the villages Urari, Kunki, and Ashti. He also described Kaitak and mentioned that it was closely related to Vurkun. Kubachi, which he considered transitional between Vurkun and Akusha. Akusha Dargwa, which consisted of Akusha proper, the Hürkilin dialects, and the Mikigi dialects. And finally, there was a separate group, Majalis Kaitak, which is now referred to as the Muiri language or dialect language. Then there's the Lak branch, which is just one language, forming a separate branch. The Avar branch, which is also one language with several dialects. The Andi branch, which consists of Andi proper, Botlech, Chmalal, Tindi, Karata, Godobiri, and Bagwalal. There's one language missing here, which is Akhwakh. But as you can see, there is a Navar dialect here called Akhwakh. We're not quite sure whether this is actually the Akhwakh language or the Avar dialect spoken in the Akhwakh area. Then there's the Dido or Tses branch, which consists of Tses, Khwashi, and Beshta. So for those of you who are familiar with the family, you will notice that there are two Tzesek languages missing. Actually, yeah, two. And then Chechen was sort of as a separate branch with English as a dialect of Chechen, and Sovatus separately. So let's move on to some more modern branching. The East Caucasian family consists of 7 generally accepted branches, which are Nach, Arandic, Tsesek, Lesgic, Dargwic, Lak, and Chinaluk. The latter 2 branches comprise only one language each, and the unity of Aro-Ando-Tsesek is almost sort of universally accepted. This is actually one macro branch, but it's not explicitly shown here. The unity of Lak and Dargwa, and especially Chinaluk, is rather uncertain. The position of Chinaluk is especially controversial. For a long time, it was treated as a Lesgic language, then as a sister branch of Lesgic, and finally, it was considered an independent branch that's probably genealogically closer to other branches of East Caucasian, but but which has simply been influenced a lot by Lexic due to aerial proximity. Now, a persistent issue in the study of East Caucasian is how many languages there are exactly, and which idioms are languages as opposed to dialects. The generally accepted list was largely established in the 1920s, and it didn't change at all between 1967 and the early 21st century. So here's a list of some different approaches. In the 1926 census, there were 29 languages where Koryakov and Kaitak were distinguished as separate languages, but Ingush and Hinukh were not distinguished as separate languages. They were subsumed under others. Chechen in the case of Ingush, and I think Tses in the case of Hinukh. In in the 1967 volume of the Languages of the Peoples of the USSR, there were again 29 languages, but this time with Ingush and Hinukh, and Koryakov and Kaitak were subsumed under Dargwa. In Catford's classification, we find the same approach. And then Alexeyev in 1999 decided to add Caucasian Albanian to the family tree. In recent years, some revisions to this classification have been proposed based on the lexico-statistical approximation of mutual intelligibility, since actually testing mutual intelligibility in such a diverse area would not be feasible, because it would only really be useful if you would be able to test an incredibly large amount of villages, and properly testing for mutual intelligibility is a very complicated, time-consuming task. So lexico-statistical approximation is calculated as the number of shared cognates in the 100-word Swedish list, where lex which share 91% or more of the words are considered dialects of the same language, and lex which share 90% or less are considered separate languages. Even in cases such as a relatively simple test where you don't need an enormous amount of data, there's not enough data for all of the relevant varieties. But nevertheless, the use of this method or the application of this method to the East Caucasian data has drastically changed the estimated number of languages. So in more recent works from the last 20 years, you can find varying numbers of East Caucasian languages, going up to 45 in total, as opposed to the 29 that were originally distinguished. So let's look at some specific cases for former dialects that might actually be languages. In the case of the Andic group, the initial list consisted of 8 languages, but now the idea that the Karata language can actually be split into Karata on one hand and Tukita on the other hand, which is a highly divergent dialect spoken in just one village, is already more or less common. Andi can probably be split into Upper Andi and Lower Andi, because these two dialects are not necessarily mutually intelligible. If speakers of Upper and Lower Andi, especially Upper Andi and the Muni variety of Lower Andi, if they want to communicate with each other, they have to sort of modify their speech in order to understand each other. And sometimes they will resort to speaking Avar, which is the local dominant lingua franca. Akhwakh is more or less conventionally already divided into Northern and Southern Akhwakh, but still under question is whether Southern Akhwakh should be split into more highly divergent varieties. There are some ideas about this, but there's not enough data on these villages. And also still sort of under question is the split from the Gadiri dialect of Chamalal from the rest of the Chamalal varieties. For the Tsethic languages, the initial list consisted of Tses, which is also often referred to as Dido, Khwarshi, Dagestan, Hunzib. In 1967, the Hinukh language was split off from Tses, and another split that is becoming more conventional is the split into Tses proper and Sagada, because Sagada was formerly virtually unstudied, and as it's now in the process of being studied, it turns out to be quite divergent, which probably licenses the status as a separate language. Not confirmed yet is the split of Khwarshi into Khwarshi proper and Ingushetia, but they are also quite divergent, but this requires further investigation. Now, the Dargic languages is probably the most controversial and about which the most has been written. So originally in the 1926 census, we have 3 Dargic languages, Dargwa, Kaitag, and Kubachi. In 1967, they were all merged into Dargwa, which has to do with policy regarding ethnicities at the time, which is something we will come back to a little bit later. Then, based on lexical statistical methods, in 2002 was proposed to recognize 11 separate Dargwa languages. In 2007, 18, in 2020, 13, and in 2021, finally, it was settled on 15 separate languages for the Dargwa branch. Now, you might wonder why, if a sort of precise method is being used, why are these numbers of languages first going up and then going down again? This has to do with the fact that there was some poor quality of data in the earlier studies that were done. And so when more and better data for certain varieties appeared, the number of languages was revised again. But then following that, new data from formerly undocumented Lex started to appear, and the number of languages again increased. For Lexic, there is not a lot of controversy. Generally, some ideas that are still under question are the split of Agul into Agul proper and the Koshan dialect as a separate language. There's some idea to split Tabasaran into northern and southern Tabasaran, which are currently just the main dialects of the language, but maybe it would be more reasonable to consider them separate languages. And a split of Rutul proper and southern Rutul. Now, all these ideas about specific languages are sort of connected to how people view their ethnic identity in a complicated way. So let's look at some of those situations. Among the speakers of Nakh languages, actually, there is a relatively straightforward correspondence between ethnic or national identity and language, which probably also is the cause that this branch is more or less without controversy in terms of what are separate languages and what are separate dialects. So Ingushetia and Chechnya are linguistically and ethnically homogeneous republics, where the respective languages have official status. And the Chechen and the Ingush have some idea of being a specific ethnic group with a specific language, and they also consider themselves to belong to a larger ethnic group, which they refer to as Vainach, which translates as our people. The third language of the branch is kind of separate in this respect, because it has been geographically and culturally separated from the other Nakh people, because it's just one village currently in Georgia, and they view themselves as ethnic Georgians, so they're kind of in terms of self-identity, they're separate from the other Nakh languages. Now, in Dagestan, the picture is a lot more complicated. Dagestanians typically have a layered identity. The most, I guess, the most essential one is their native village. So within their own neighborhood, they identify themselves by their native village. And this village name also functions as the language name for local varieties. And then within Dagestan, they typically associate with a larger ethnic grouping, some of which are sort of artificial. And outside of Dagestan, they identify simply as Dagestanians. So these larger ethnic groupings that are currently distinguished in Dagestan date back to the Soviet period, actually. There is some reason why specifically these groupings were made based on the historical situation before that. But essentially, starting from the 1930s, the Soviet government created these sort of macro ethnic groups where they subsumed a lot of smaller people under, not to distinguish too many different ethnicities. So for example, speakers of Andic and Cesic languages, as well as speakers of Archi and Mekhod Dargwa, were ethnically subsumed under Avars. Prior to that, Avar was their main lingua franca, or their main L2. So they sort of formed this zone of people who spoke Avar, and they were sort of categorized as ethnic Avars. The standard Dargo language was created in this period based on the Akusha dialect for all Dargans. Separate identities within the Dargo group, such as Kaitak, which is associated with the former Kaitak state, and Kuwachi, were no longer distinguished starting from this period. Within the Lesgic group, different ethnicities were distinguished, and at the same time, writing systems were created for some of these respective languages. So basically, they tried to create some major ethnic groups associated with a specific language that should have also a writing system. So as a result, there are 11 East Caucasian languages which have official status in the Eastern Caucasus next to Russian. First of all, English in Ingushetia, Chechen in Chechnya, and also in Dagestan. Agul, Avar, Dargwa, Lezgian, Lak, Rutu, Tabasran, Tat, and Sakur in Dagestan. I see I accidentally left in the non-East Caucasian language, which is Tat over here, because I initially just made a list of all the official languages in Dagestan and then decided to group them by affiliation. So yeah, because there are not just East Caucasian official languages in Dagestan, also Kumyk, Nagai, Azerbaijani, and Tat have official status. For some of the East Caucasian languages, the writing system was developed only very recently, such as for Tsakhur, which was ultimately developed in 1989 after an abandoned first attempt in the 1930s as well, and Rutul and Agul, which received the writing system in 1990. For others, the Cyrillic system was introduced in 1938 after a brief experiment with Latin script as well. So before the Soviet Union introduced Cyrillic writing systems, the speakers of East Caucasian languages also used Arabic script, but this was not very widely used by all of the speakers of these languages. Languages with an official writing system are also taught as mother tongue at school in Dagestan, which is like a separate additional class in addition to Russian language and other language classes. But this also means that speakers of unwritten languages are taught a different language as mother tongue, namely the main literary language for the ethnic group that they are subsumed under. So this means, for example, Avar for Andic and Cesic speakers, and all ethnic Dargans are taught Akusha Dargwa as their native language, even though their native variety might be very distant from Akusha Dargwa. In some of the mixed ethnic villages that currently exist, mother tongue lessons are provided for majorities. So for example, if you have a village that is half Avar, half Dargwa, and with a third smaller group, then you can choose between native language Avar, native language Dargwa, or Russian as mother tongue, which is also a subject taught, and which is distinct from regular Russian language lessons. Now, the situation among the East Caucasians in Azerbaijan is a little bit different. I'm not sure if everybody remembers the picture from the beginning of the talk, but there are several East Caucasian languages which are spoken exclusively in northern Azerbaijan. And among them, there are quite a few where the linguistic and ethnic identity are aligned, such as in the case of Udi or the speakers of Lesbian and Avar that you find in this area. The Budur consider themselves a separate ethnic group, but this is not very strongly connected to language. Chinaluk view themselves as Chinaluk ethnically and linguistically, but Azerbaijani based on their location. So it's kind of similar to this layered Dagestanian identity. And the Kris do not have a strong group identity as distinct from Azerbaijani. Now let's look at how these identities show up in the census data. So the following censuses have been organized since the Northern Caucasus became part of the Russian Empire. There was a big census in 1897, but unfortunately we don't have these data. In the period of the USSR, there were censuses in 1926, 1937, 1939, 1959, 1970, etc. Of which 1926 is actually the most complete and the most detailed. So that's the one that we use. Once the Soviet Union disintegrated, a census was organized in 2002. There was one in 2010, and there is one currently going on this year. So we have access to digitized censuses for different periods to sort of replace the data from 1897, which we don't have. We have rural registers of 1886 and 1895, which also show ethnic groups per settlement at the time, and censuses of 1926 and 2010. Unfortunately, these data for now are limited to Dagestan. So there are 4 censuses in the database which have been digitized and connected to each other. So you can see if a village existed in the 19th century, whether it still exists in 1926, whether maybe the name changed, whether the population changed, etc. There are plans to add 1926 data for neighboring regions as well, but unfortunately it's not there yet. And these databases show the populations per locality, per village or city. So for the 19th century and 1926, this entails ethnicity per locality. In 2010, ethnicity and language per locality. We use language in this case because while Andic and Cettic people were ethnically subsumed under Avars, in many cases they indicated their actual native language. Some caveats to this data are that, well, the complex relationships between language, ethnicity, and group identity that we already mentioned. Also, ethnic labels and census do not necessarily reflect people's self-identification. And some grouping and interpretation by census workers evidently did occur, which we can see from some mistakes they made or some groups which were switched around, but the true extent of this is unknown. Sometimes also you find groups which we know that people don't necessarily associate with this grouping. So it was obviously the result of some interpretation. So here is a graph of the main ethnic groups in Dagestan in the period from 1886 to 2010. As you can see, there's a general tendency towards growth, but this graph actually also reveals that starting from after 1926, a lot of people were subsumed under Avar, because you have more ethnic Avars than you have people who indicated Avar as their native language. All the other languages show more or less similar trend lines. So the population between 1886 and 1926 was more or less stable. The only group that had growth in this period were the Russians, which makes sense because they started migrating to the area in this period. So another interesting thing about the Russians is that their line does not go down after the fall of the Soviet Union, which makes Dagestan quite different from Chechnya and Ingushetia. For example, here you can see the what happened to the Russian population in all three of the republics, Chechnya, Dagestan, and Ingushetia. As you can see, there were initially many more Russians in Chechnya than there were in Dagestan, but almost all of them left. Same for Ingushetia, and in Dagestan, quite the opposite. In 1926, there were not quite as many as there are now. Most of these Russians currently live in urban areas. So initially they were located in the northern periphery, but they've mostly abandoned these villages. So you can still find a lot of villages there which have Russian names, but which are inhabited by Dagestanians. But essentially, if you look at where they are located, you find one or two Russians basically all over Dagestan. I think the graph for Dargwa is quite telling in itself. Between 1886 and 1926, you can see Kaytak and Kubachi represented, and then they just disappear because they have disappeared into the larger Dargwa group. The Lexical languages also show fairly normal trend lines, which, with one exception, which is not shown in this graph, which is Archi, because Archi was also subsumed under Avars. So you can see that after 1926, the number of Archi speakers sort of plummets. Now, here we use specifically language because language can be more reliable than ethnic identity, because some of the people who were subsumed under Avars just considered themselves ethnic Avars, but they still considered their language to be different. But since they were also taught Avar as what is literally called mother tongue in school, for some populations you see that they also sort of shift in terms of their language, not because they speak a different language, but just because they consider Avar their official native language. For Andic, the picture is very mixed. So you can see that some groups are going up in a regular fashion, like Andi and Botik, and some of them have very dramatic declines. Now, these steep declines are due to a shift in identification, basically, because if you look at specific villages, then you can see that basically between this decision to subsume these people under Avars, you can see that the ethnic identification of the entire village more or less shifts, and sometimes also the language that they report to speak, even though we know from field data from people who have visited these areas that the original language is still spoken in the area. The positive trend lines are likely due to activism of native speakers to raise awareness about this topic, because the numbers in the 2002 census were much worse for virtually all of the Andic languages. So, for example, here you can see that Botlek has a fairly normal line. There are currently according to the 2010 census, there were 3,500 Botlichs, which is less than there actually are, but it's close to the truth. Whereas in 2002, I think there were 16 of them or something like this. Yeah. For Czech, you see a similar picture where some are going up and some are going down. We're not quite sure yet what happens with Czech and Bishta between 1886 and 1926, because generally the languages, all of the languages were more or less stable in this period, but these languages for some reason went down, and we're not sure what is the reason for this yet. Now, the Turkic people in the area are also quite complex, except Kumyk. Among the Kumyks, there is a fairly straightforward relationship between language and ethnic identity. So you can see a fairly normal line here. But with Azeri, this situation is more complicated. In 1886, they were not labeled as Azeri, but as Tatar. In 1926, they were labeled as Turks. And finally, in 2010, they were labeled as Azeri. So we know this because we just looked at the population of villages which we know to be consistently monoethnic Azeri villages, and we just looked at the population in these specific villages. So in the 1886 census, there were several Tatars attested, but they were actually Azeri, and the real Tatars from the Volga area appeared in Dagestan in towns only in 1926. Tats are also quite complex. They had some shifts in their in how they identified themselves and how they were identified. So, for example, the speakers of Judeo-Tat in the 1886 census were counted simply as Jews. But the problem with this number is that the number of Jews consisted not only of mountain Jews, but also of different Jewish groups. So we can't just take this number and say this is the population of Judeo-Tat speakers at the time. They had a dramatic decline after 1926 for different reasons. We know that many relocated to Israel, and others started to identify as Tat, started to ethnically identify as Tat. You can see this from, for example, the village Nugdi. In 1886, it was inhabited by 483 Jews and 10 Tatars. In 1926, there were 278 mountain Jews and nobody else. In 2010, there were 44 mountain Jews, 4 regular Jews, and some Azeri and lesbians. So the Muslim Tat were in 1886, they were just identified as Tat, but due to a shift in identification, they more or less disappeared closer to 1926 because they started identifying as Turkic, sort of in parallel with the Azeri population, with whom they have a strong connection in Dagestan. And by 2010, they had shifted their identification to Azeri, even though to some extent Tat is still spoken by the Muslim Tats. So the increase of Tats after 1926 is likely due to a shift in identification of the mountain Jews. So the Tats of the 19th century stopped identifying as Tat, but then another group started identifying as such, at least in the census data. One small note, which I'm going to do quickly because we don't have a lot of time left and we have a lot of material left. There's one village in northern Dagestan which has shifted from Tat to Armenian. These Tat speakers arrived in the area in the 18th century and they ethnically identify as Armenians. This was already the case in the earliest available registered data from 1883. So we didn't really have all their census data for this village, but Yura looked in some other data to find the village, and their identification was basically Armenian as far as the record goes. When Soviet schooling was introduced, Armenian was taught as mother tongue in this area because they ethnically identified as Armenian. And during a visit of mine to the village in 2021, my consultants there did not mention that older generations spoke a different language. So maybe this was already longer ago, or maybe they simply didn't know. And the local variety of Armenian reflects possible origins in an area of northern Azerbaijan, where Armeno-Tat was also spoken. Persians. I think we can skip over this slide because it was more a question that we had, because in the 1926 census, suddenly 2,844 Persians appear who were not there in the 19th century, and we have no real good explanation for this. So if anyone has any ideas, please let us know. All right, highlands versus lowlands. By the time of the Russian conquest of the region, the East Caucasian languages occupied the mountainous area north of the main Caucasus ridge, southern Ingushetia and Chechnya and southwestern Dagestan, and some areas on the southern slope among Georgians and Azerbaijanis. The East Caucasian languages likely branched out from the historical homeland along rivers and their tributaries and uphill. So yeah, on this map you can more or less see this with the Samur over here and the Sulak over here. And if you're interested more in this topic, then you can watch Johanna Nichols' lecture from 2020, where she goes into more detail of how this might have occurred. East Caucasians moved uphill despite the more difficult living conditions to stay safe during raids from warring empires, and the lowlands were inhabited later by Turkic people and became economic centers. The highlanders would temporarily move to the lowlands for trading and seasonal work and acquired Turkic languages for inter-ethnic communication. In Dagestan, it was also common to speak several languages spoken in the more direct neighborhood, as Nina Dobrushina in her 2020 lecture talked about in a lot of detail. Turkic languages were also lingua francas in key marketplaces, which are shown on this map. So here you have Nagay in the north in Mozlok and Kizlyar, Kumyk in Buynaksk. This is the only exception where Avar is used as a market language in Khunzakh, and Azeri is spoken in Derbentes, typical lingua franca. Now, mountains are generally considered retention zones that foster linguistic diversity as well as complexity. And Koshevoy and Daniel found a correlation between altitude and language size in Dagestan, showing that larger languages in the area are more likely to be spoken in the lowlands, and smaller languages are more likely to be spoken in the highlands. These factors are collinear. Both are thought to influence linguistic diversity and complexity. And additionally, Dobrushina and Maros found a correlation between language size and multilingualism. Speakers of smaller languages were found to be more multilingual. A possible implication is that larger languages in the area are also more likely to be spoken as L2, which is another factor that is known to influence complexity. So here you can see the altitude of different genealogical groups. So the average altitude of different villages. Both of these studies which found these correlations were conducted on Dagestanian data. Probably wouldn't work so well on the entire Eastern Caucasus because Dagestan and Chechnya and Ingushetia are fairly different in several key aspects. For example, typical of Dagestan is strict village level endogamy and transhumance of highlanders to the lowlands for seasonal work and trade. And the Chechen and Ingush practice strict exogamy and no transhumance. And the respective republics are linguistically homogeneous, and the average altitude, if you take the current numbers, will be relatively low due to migration to the lowlands. Now some changes in the language territory in the 19th and 20th century. During the 19th century, no major shifts occurred. Ingush and Chechen continued to settle in the lands to the northwest, which had been abandoned by the Kabardians, and the northeast. At the same time, some Russian villages appeared in central Ingushetia and adjacent areas of Chechnya. Avar, Dargwa, and Lezgi started to slowly settle and move downriver. In the 1820s, Sovutush finally resettled from Tusheti to the current area in Lower Kakheti. So you can see that shown here. The southernmost Lezgic communities, Udi, Rutu, and Lezgi, continued to either shift or be displaced by Azerbaijani. During and right after the Russian conquest of the Caucasus in the 1850s and 1870s, many Nakh and some Dagestanians were forced to migrate to the Ottoman Empire, now Turkey, and some of them later returned to Russia. There are no exact numbers, there are just some estimates. So for example, 40,000 or 105,000 Chechen and Ingush, 7,000 or 20,000 Dagestanians. And as far as we know, among these Dagestanians are speakers of Avar, Andi, Tses, Laks, Bakhar, Kaitak, and Lezgi. There might be more, but we just don't know. In the 1920s, the Chechen and Ingush were settled to some areas previously occupied by Russians, or more precisely Cossacks, and continued to found new settlements in northern Dagestan, while other tendencies went on slowly. So the first Dargwa Kutans appeared around Gugden, which are former Kume clans, and they're shown here on the map. So Kutan was originally a shepherd settlement in winter pastures, and they were first founded in the 1920s by Avars and Dargans not far from their original territory. Then in 1944, all Chechen and Ingush were deported to Central Asia. After that, the whole population of 114 villages and part of another 110 villages from Dagestan were resettled to the eastern part of Chechnya. More than half of the speakers of Andic and Sezik and some minor Dargwic languages were moved to these lands. And different Dagestanian ethnic groups were sort of settled interspersively. 1/5 or 1/4 of the new settlers died of malaria and other diseases they were not accustomed to, because there was a very different different region with very different circumstances. After 1957, the Chechen and Ingush began to return to their lands, and this process of gradual return took more than a decade for them to resettle. Southern Ingushetia and southwestern Chechnya were closed for resettlement, so the speakers of local dialects were settled in mixed villages in the plains. Less than half of the resettled Dagestanians returned to their original homes. The rest were resettled once more, this time to Kumyk, Nagai, and Russian areas in north-central Dagestan. And this was the beginning of a gradual change of the ethno-linguistic profile of northern Dagestan, which we also refer to as Kutanization, because after the Second World War, Kutan-type settlements appeared further and further to the north, and these new settlements became more and more permanent, whereas formerly they were not very permanent. Some of these former Kutans became officially recognized, and settlements of the administrative districts from where their inhabitants resettled. So this is a little bit complicated. You have a village in northern Dagestan that belongs to an administrative district in a completely different place, just because their inhabitants originally came from the other district. These former Turkic areas in the north are now populated for the most part by highlanders. So the northern part of Dagestan initially was almost empty. It was initially inhabited by nomadic Nagais mostly. Then the Russians appeared, but in small quantities, and only now this area is actively being settled by new inhabitants. Another new development is that since the 1970s and 1980s, Dagestanians, especially Dargan and Avar, and also Chechen, started to settle in the Stavropol Krai, which is a neighboring region to Dagestan and Chechnya in the north. Northern Chechnya and Ingushetia were largely occupied by Chechen and Ingush in the 1990s, who displaced the Russians who lived there before that. Since the 1990s, many East Caucasians migrated to other regions of Russia, such as Siberia, Astrakhan, and Rostov. So essentially, East Caucasian is the fastest growing family in Russia. It's the only language family in Russia which more than doubled its area in the last 100 years. The number of their speakers increased more than 4 times. In 1926, there were 867,812. And in 2010, there were 3.5 million. However, this downhill migration that is becoming more and more common is altering the distribution of languages, and as a result, it's also altering their language ecologies. So whereas some villages in this new Kutan area seem to remain satellites of their original village, many lowland towns are multi-ethnic and multilingual, with direct neighbors who are not from the same area. So they will communicate with each other mostly in Russian. This facilitates the spread of Russian as a general lingua franca and the disappearance of traditional patterns of multilingualism. In addition, the area is poorly charted. It's largely unclear who lives where and to what extent they still speak their original language or dialect. I kind of expect the worst, but we can't really tell whether languages are really well preserved here or not really. So about language vitality in general. Here's a map from the UNESCO Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger, which has about the traditional list of East Caucasian languages in it. And basically, all of the languages spoken in the area are evaluated as under some kind of threat. You can see that all the main literary languages are vulnerable, which means they're still spoken by children, but in limited domains. The unwritten and some smaller written languages are evaluated as definitely endangered, which means they are no longer passed on to children. And some single village languages at the periphery are evaluated as severely endangered, which means that only grandparents speak it, and parents have passive knowledge, children don't speak it at all. So you can see this for Tsilvatush in Georgia. I think this is Udi, and then here a few more smaller Lexical languages spoken in this area. There are 30 East Caucasian languages in the Atlas. There's only one Dargwa language, so the evaluation of vulnerable for Dargwa is basically just about one language, but it does distinguish Huaxi and Infukwari. Now, some cases shown on this map might actually be less dramatic in reality. So many children actually still speak Andic languages. This is currently changing, and there's definitely some kind of negative trend going on, but it's probably not as bad yet as it's shown on this map. Also, Udi is counted twice on this map. One time for each republic in which it is threatened, while, for example, Lesgian and Avar are counted once, which kind of gives a not very reliable picture, because communities speaking the same language are not necessarily homogeneous in their attitudes, as is shown nicely in a study by Clifton et al. On the Lesgians in Azerbaijan. And this is just about Lesgians who live in Azerbaijan. There's definitely also a difference between Lesgian in Azerbaijan and Lesgian in Dagestan, not to mention smaller languages and divergent idioms, which are not shown in this map at all and which could actually be disappearing currently. We just simply don't know. All right, we've made it to the questions. I think we have 10 minutes left for questions.
Yes, thank you, Samira, and thank you, Yuri, for this very interesting talk. So there were some questions and comments. Part of them were partially answered, but I will share my screen now so you can see. So you can see the question. Okay, Samira, you should.
I should stop sharing my screen, right? Yeah.
Okay. And now you can see mine, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay. In fact, I tried to answer some questions during the talk. So if someone feels that it's not enough, please, maybe they could ask them again. I don't know.
Well, or maybe there are some of them which didn't get an answer. So the first one was answered already. Maybe you want to comment about the second one by Michael Daniel.
The expectation is that the population of Russia and Dagestan dropped significantly after 1990. It would be interesting to see whether this expectation is not borne out. Yeah, that's a good point. I think for the general population of Russians in the area, that would definitely make sense to just get all the censuses and see what happens to get a more precise line. Yeah. I think the question by Agul was answered.
About handicaping.
Yeah, question about markets. What about the markets of Botlekh, Kumukh, Tzdakhar, and other highland markets? It does not look like Turkic languages were used there. That's true, but we also don't have very good data on which languages were used there. So, for example, Botlekh is mentioned by Wixman in his overview. And he mentions the fact that Botlekh had an important market as a factor in why the Botlekh language still exists and wasn't completely replaced by Avar. But as far as we have data on Botlekh and its markets, Avar is spoken there as a lingua franca. So it's not quite clear what kind of patterns are common in these areas.
Okay. Yes, there was a question by Tanya Philippe, but this was also answered. I think let me just check whether there are. Yes, there are some questions that weren't answered so far. So if you want to look at the
homeland.
The ancient homeland of the East Caucasian.
In fact, we don't know where was the ancient homeland, and what you said about proceeding up the rivers, it's rather later times after the initial homeland.
Yeah, so I think if you're interested in getting a clearer picture of this, I think I can recommend Joanna Nichols' lecture from last year, because she goes into more detail and she also points out some parts where the theory doesn't quite work geographically and where it does work. So I think she probably does a better job of explaining it than I can do right now off the top of my head.
About Astrakhan, yes, but large groups of Dagestani and Chechen speakers are all over southern Russia. So not only Astrakhan, but we had to limit ourselves by some map, not to show all South Russia. Yes, of course, in Astrakhan Oblast there are a lot of Chechens and Dagestanians.
Can you show the chat? Oh, yeah, they're appearing here as well.
Yes.
There's another question.
This is a good question. I'm afraid we don't have any data on it. I mean, I don't know anything or
Not for
Next to
United
nothing
States
about
Italy.
Turkic, unfortunately.
For current time, yes, maybe we have, but not for 200 ago.
And to be honest, when I was preparing this talk, I was a little bit puzzled by how the 19th century researchers decided which languages belong together, which ones are dialects, which ones are mutually intelligible or similar enough. Yeah, it's not quite clear.
Okay, so if there aren't any more questions, then I would like to thank everyone for participating.
Chiara, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but Ezekiel, our colleague, said that he has an announcement.
I know. Yeah, I know.
Right.
Yeah. I was just going to give him the word. I just want to, before that, to thank you once again for the lecture and everyone for participating and for your questions and comments. And thank you once again to Samira and Yuri. So Ezekiel, if you want to.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I just want to make an announcement. Michael Daniel here with me and together with Susanna Michaelis, Jeff Hood and Pier Paolo Di Carlo. We are organizing a more or less related workshop for the SLE next year. It's on language change in spatially and socially separated speech communities. We will send around the call tonight or tomorrow, but it's probably of interest of people in the audience here. So we are waiting for your answer.
Thank you. Thank you, and see you all next week.